Welcome everyone to our webinar on managing safety for remote workers. My name is James True. I'm a practice group leader in LegalVision's employment and safety team, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Dickson. Dickson's a lawyer in our team. Now, before we begin, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. You'll receive a recording of this webinar and the slides in your email afterwards. In relation to questions, you can submit them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end, hopefully be able to get to everyone. We also ask that you please do complete the feedback survey after the webinar. The reason we ask that is that we want to continually improve these webinars as best we can, make them as useful for you as possible. So your feedback is very much appreciated. The other thing to add is that all attendees are able to receive a free consultation with us, basically just to discuss how we can help you with any of your legal needs, just not just limited to what we're talking about today. So in order to request that consultation, just provide us with your contact details in the survey that appears at the end of this webinar. So we'll get into it in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. So number one, your WHS obligations, just a brief recap of what the law says. What is a workplace and what is a remote worker? The risks in relation to remote workers, how to assess and control those risks, and then some recommended policies and procedures for those remote workers. At the end of the webinar, we will be answering some of your questions. So as I said, if you can submit them throughout, and we'll get to all those that we can. I'll hand over to Dickson now to set the scene for us, just with an overview of WHS obligations.
Yeah, great. Thanks, James. As to set the scene for our discussion on managing safety for remote workers, why don't we start with some context for WHS laws and the obligations contained within those laws. So model WHS laws were developed by Safe Work Australia in 2011 to provide for a balanced and nationally consistent framework to secure the health and safety of workers and workplaces. Now, all Australian states and territories have implemented these model WHS laws except for Victoria. What that means is everywhere but Victoria is now using the language of WHS, while Victoria still talks about OH&S. That being said, the obligations are very similar, and what we're discussing today is still relevant for Victoria, but we're just going to use the term WHS throughout. Now, WHS laws provide that there are three key duty holders who have a role in managing WHS risks. These are firstly the persons conducting a business or undertaking, the PCBU. Secondly, your officers or senior managers, and thirdly, your workers. So let's consider each of these duty holders now. Firstly, the PCBU. The PCBU covers any kind of business and includes sole traders, companies, partnerships, and unincorporated bodies or associations. PCBU has the primary duty of care to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers and others in the workplace. Practically speaking, this obligation includes the provision of safe equipment, facilities, physical work site, and systems or methods of work, the safe use, handling, and storage of materials, the provision of information, training, instructions, and supervision, as well as the monitoring of the health of workers and conditions at the workplace. Now, a critical aspect and a really common question that we receive about this obligation is, how far do I need to go to comply with my WHS duties? So a PCBU's duty to do what is reasonably practicable means that a small business would need to take different steps from a large corporation to ensure a safe working environment. It means that there are different expectations on businesses who operate on a remote mining site compared to businesses whose workers solely work from home. It also means that some risks need to be fully eliminated, but others don't. There are several factors relevant to determine what is reasonably practicable in the circumstances, including the likelihood of the risk occurring, the degree of harm that might result from the risk, any knowledge about the risk and ways of managing the risk, the availability and suitability of options to eliminate or minimize risks, as well as the costs associated with the available options of managing the risk. Now let's move on to the next duty holder, officers. Officers are people who make decisions that have an impact on the whole or a substantial part of your business. And this could be your senior managers or your C-suite executives. Under WHS laws, officers have an obligation to exercise due diligence to ensure that the PCBU complies with their WHS duties. Officers can meet their WHS duties by taking reasonable steps to acquire and keep their WHS knowledge up to date, to understand the risks associated with the business and its specific operations, to ensure that suitable resources and processes are in place and being used to manage WHS risks, and to ensure that appropriate reporting processes are in place and being followed for WHS incidents and risks. Let's now consider the third duty holder, workers. So workers are people who carry out work in any capacity for a PCBU and include employees, contractors, apprentices, trainees, and volunteers. WHS laws require workers to take reasonable care of their health and safety, as well as the health and safety of others in the workplace. Workers are also required to comply with reasonable instructions given by your business and to cooperate with any reasonable WHS policies or procedures that your business has notified to them. And we're going to touch on these policies and procedures a little bit later in the presentation. Now that we have an overview of the three key duty holders who have a role in managing WHS risks, let's consider the definitions of a workplace and remote working, key kind of aspects of our presentation today. So firstly, a workplace. It's just any place where work is carried out for a business and includes any place where a worker goes or is likely to be while at work. So this could include your offices, factories, shops, construction sites, and vehicles. Remote working covers those who work from home and are generally away from the team and have limited physical interactions with colleagues. Remote working also covers those who work in physically remote locations, such as in regional areas. It's worth noting that remote workers may have interactions with people, but can be isolated from assistance because of where or when they are working, or maybe the nature of the work that they are doing. So to give you a few examples, all-night convenience store and service station attendants, real estate agents, and health and community workers working with members of the public, but isolated from their colleagues, are remote and isolated workers. I'll now hand it over to James to discuss the risks to remote workers.
Okay, thanks, Dickson. So yeah, look, there's obviously sort of two categories of remote workers there, and I know a lot of people will be joining here thinking about their workforce, which is working from home. So we'll just touch on the risk to the physical risk to those working from home first. So you have ergonomic risks, and that's really associated with the workstation that the employees are using in their home office. So chairs, desks, monitors, the location of sort of other accessories that are incorrectly set up, well, they can cause issues, things like eye strain, RSI injuries, or musculoskeletal issues. So Dickson will touch on this later in relation to policies, but having workers complete things like an ergonomic assessment, a kind of working from home checklist, making sure they're utilizing the correct equipment, then it's all sort of adjustable and correctly adjusted, can really minimize your risk in this respect when we're looking at ergonomic risks. There are electrical risks, so things caused by computers, other equipment with power cables. Now the power cables can be a trip hazard, but otherwise the electrical risk can be in relation to malfunctions that cause shocks or fires. Common risks for employees working from home are all related to home kitchens, kettles, boiling water, zip taps, toasters, microwaves. Basically all of your kitchen appliances can present personal injury risks. Finally, thinking about thermal comfort. It's another thing that Safe Work puts a lot of attention on. So work needs to be carried out in an environment that provides, well, appropriate comfort for workers really in all seasons. So there are obvious things to ensure that, things like air conditioning and fans and windows and electric heating, insulation, airflow, direct sunlight, all of those types of things can be useful in controlling those risks. But wherever you've got an employee working from home, all of those risks are going to be present. and it's important to make sure that you're doing something to make sure that you're implementing controls to those risks, and we'll talk to that shortly. Moving on, just talking about physical risks generally in relation to other remote workers. So Dickson mentioned some examples there of, service station attendants or care workers. Violence is a key risk. Remote workers, isolated workers, people working on their own can be an easy target for violence. Where someone's carrying out manual tasks without assistance creates yet another risk for health and safety. Remote workers have a limited ability to call for help. Emergency assistance in relation to physical injuries. So again, the remoteness or the isolation is creating an additional risk there in sort of even post-incident procedures that you may want to take. The other thing that happens for remote workers or someone working alone is that there's a limited ability for others to identify risks or provide a second opinion on how to safely perform tasks. So one of the key aspects in any kind of safety management system is always around making sure everyone has their eyes open to potential risks and hazards, and that everyone's continuously talking and consulting with one another. Once you take that out for a remote or solo worker, then you've got an increased risk in not being able to identify hazards. Moving on, there are mental health risks. So there are recent amendments to the WHS laws, and they've really focused on what are now called psychosocial risks. This is an area that regulators are placing an increased focus on. In essence, the changes confirm that things like the structure of a workplace and management and the method of management can actually present risks to health and safety. So in particular, when it comes to remote or isolated work, what we'll talk about here are things that can be relevant to those risks. Key point is that the regulators have identified all of these aspects as risks. So they're well and truly understood by those enforcing the laws that these are going to be risks for your isolated workers. Isolation and limited access to managers or supervisors. Inadequate or poor management which arises from the isolation. So that can be if managers may be quite good at handling people who are sitting at a desk next to them, but really struggle to pivot to managing people who are now remote. This has been a very common thing we've seen with a lot of our clients, particularly during the pandemic, but increasingly now where big parts of workforces are still working from home. Managers have often struggled to make the adjustment to how they manage someone if they don't have them sitting right next to them and they're not able to sort of, in a sense, watch them work, and changing their style for someone who's remote. So again, that in and of itself can create a risk to health and safety, is when the management technique is not as good as it could or should be. Poor organizational change management, something quite often forgotten about. The message here is, don't forget about your remote workers when you're consulting about change. So businesses will go through all sorts of change and they'll do it very frequently. But, again, where the kind of work from home or remote work is still relatively new, you need to be making sure that all your consultation processes aren't forgetting anyone who's not sort of visible because they're there in the office with you. Finally, inadequate reward and recognition. So again, this is really just a matter of don't forget your remote workers, just because people, aren't in your face every day in the office doing good things that you're recognizing. Make sure you're making a positive step to recognize the work of those who are not exactly visible on a day-to-day. So I guess that's really identifying some of the risks. The important thing that a business needs to be doing is implementing some controls. So if we move forward to sort of assessing and controlling risk for remote workers, things to think about here when you're assessing a risk. Well, that includes things like the length of time the person may be working alone. How long will they actually need to be alone in order to finish the job? Are we talking about a very short period? You may not need to do much. Are we talking about long-term periods of isolation? You might need to be implementing greater controls. Think about the time of day when the person is going to be working alone. So if we take that example of a remote worker being someone working in a service station, well, that person working alone late at night might be at greater risk of exposure to violence than when they're working alone during the day. So again, you may change your controls depending on the time of day. Communication is a really important thing to think about when you're trying to make an assessment of the risk. So what forms of communication does the worker actually have access to? Are there procedures for regular contact with the worker? If we think about emergency communication, will that system work properly in all situations in terms of being able to call for help? If the communication systems are vehicle-based, it's very common when we're talking about, again, obviously not your working from home employees, but those working in remote locations. Well, do you have arrangements in place to cover that worker if they're away from the vehicle? So it's a common thing for businesses to make the whole system vehicle-based in terms of how they can sort of radio back for help or communicate with others. But to not then consider what happens if they're not actually near the vehicle. So all those things would need to be considered. The location of the work needs to be considered. So is actually the remote location that they're in, does that make immediate rescue, or does that make the emergency services attending difficult? And again, things like what would happen if you have a vehicle breakdown? Is that your sole thing you're relying on to handle the remote location? Need to think about the nature of the work. So what machinery, tools, and equipment is being used. Think about whether there are high risk activities involved. So are people working at heights? Are they working with electricity, hazardous substances, or hazardous plant in general? Does fatigue come into play? So remote workers, long hours driving a vehicle or operating machinery, fatigue becomes critical. Think about whether there's an increased risk of violence or aggression when workers have to deal with clients or customers by themselves. So again, this is, we've got a very broad spectrum of what we're talking about with remote workers. It's, that can be someone working alone in a petrol station, working alone in a retail store, or it can be a worker or a group of workers, out in the Cooper Basin on an oil and gas rig. The same considerations need to be taken into account when we're looking at, well, what actually is the impact of that remoteness or that isolation and the risk that it sort of adds for their work environment. So other things, that you literally may have to think about whether there's a risk of attack by an animal, reptiles, insects, sea creatures. Again, probably not for your work from home employees. You would hope not. But of course, depending on where someone's working, these are all the types of things that potentially arise when you're looking at the impact of remote work. Consider also the skills and capabilities of that worker. So are we talking about someone who's very experienced and capable in that environment? Are they able to make sound judgments about their own safety? Or is this someone who's very green and very new to that environment that in and of itself can create risks? Even things like you're aware of pre-existing medical conditions that can increase the risk. The next question, I suppose, here is, you go through the process of identifying all of those risks and quantifying them, how serious the risk is, what is the risk of harm, how serious would that harm be? Are we talking about catastrophic consequences if something goes wrong, or are we talking about very minor injuries if something goes on? Dickson talked about before your obligation to do what is reasonably practicable to minimize or to eliminate or to minimize a risk. And that's your obligation that you need to be cognizant of at all times when you're implementing your controls. So, something as simple as a buddy system might be able to respond to a lot of those risks which are raised by remote work. If we're talking about workers who are working from home, a home-based office, well, workplace layout and design, having a work from home checklist, and Dickson's going to discuss that more shortly, but there are absolutely controls you can put in place, ergonomic assessments, just to make sure that all the risks for a work from home employee can be considered and managed to an appropriate level. You don't have to go too far. You have to do what's reasonably practicable. Things like training, information, and instruction. These are all things which can control risks. They can limit risks. Having available first aid and then having appropriate communication systems. And that's a really broad category. That can be in the context of workers, say, in a remote location, so satellite communications and personal distress beacons, or it can be, applied in the context of an office environment and having appropriate communication systems, using online messaging systems. So there's a very broad spectrum of what can be considered, but you still want to think about all of those aspects when you're looking at controlling the risks you've identified. I'll hand back to Dickson now. We just want to cover some maybe policies and procedures that you want to have in place in the workplace, all there to really focus on your obligations, identifying risks, and making sure that you have something in place to control those risks.
Yeah, thanks, James. So policies and procedures, they're really useful tools to communicate the obligations and expectations of your workers. And we really do recommend implementing workplace policies, such as policies relating to WHS, anti-discrimination, bullying and harassment, and relating to IT as well. Now, in relation to WHS policies, we do have a few kind of tips and suggestions. So firstly, check that your policies are correctly drafted, including to confirm that they apply to your workers even when they're working remotely, for example, from home. You should also ensure that the policies are clear on their obligations in relation to safety, as well as consider, maybe depending on the nature of the work, whether you might need more bespoke or tailored operational type policies. Examples could be policies about emergency procedures and communication systems when working remotely, or James talked about a work from home policy with a work from home checklist, and that's a really common document that we prepare and provide for our clients, and it's a way to help them to identify, assess, and control risks. It's a checklist you can provide to your workers who are working from home, get them to fill it out, and based on the information provided, you can make a decision on, well, what are some reasonable steps, if any, that need to be taken to eliminate or minimize risks that I identified as well. So that's policies and procedures. And that really just concludes the main content of our webinar. I know we've covered a lot of content today. So if you'd like to consolidate or learn more about your WHS obligations, particularly for remote workers, you can download our Safety Essentials for SMEs guide. Also wanted to flag that we have an upcoming event next week on the topic of conducting an equity capital raise that may be of interest to you, and there's a link there for you to register if you are interested. And we're going to answer your questions shortly. To give you a bit more time to submit them, we'll just take a quick minute to tell you about our membership. So LegalVision's membership is a cost-effective alternative to the expensive hourly rates that you experience with other law firms. For an affordable monthly fee, you receive certainty and all-inclusive legal services, such as unlimited document review and drafting, which would include reviewing or drafting your employment contracts and your core workplace policies. It includes unlimited consultations with our team of specialist lawyers to discuss your employment needs and any other legal needs for your business, such as contracts, business structuring, and disputes. Our membership also includes and offers unlimited domestic trademark registration and much more, all for a very reasonable monthly fee. You can think of our membership as having your own in-house counsel will take care of all the business as usual legal work, so you can focus on running your business. And if you are in-house counsel, our membership is a cost-effective solution for outsourcing additional legal work. Now, if you're an existing LegalVision member, you can also add on our WHS advisory service, which just gives you a comprehensive WHS risk management and compliance framework, ongoing training and legal support to help you comply with your legal obligations and help you manage safety for your remote workers. If you want to learn more about our membership and the WHS advisory service, you can request a free consultation when the survey appears at the end of the webinar. So let's answer some of your questions, and thanks for submitting your questions. Keep them coming through as they come up as well. So let's start off with a couple of hopefully kind of simple and quick questions. We've got one here around is everything that we've talked about relevant to the not-for-profit sector, and secondly, how does what we've talked about apply to contractors who work from home? So I think the short answer initially is what we've talked about does apply to the not-for-profit sector, and it also applies to contractors. But how does it actually apply? You can touch on that, James.
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about the not-for-profit sector, if you come back to what we were talking about at the beginning in relation to the three key duty holders, the first one there being a PCBU, which is the language that the WHS obligation uses. So it's a person conducting a business or undertaking. Now, the idea with that is the law was drafted so that duty holder was extremely broad. They weren't going to make it just a company or an employer to hold the obligations. They wanted this to cover basically absolutely everyone. So yes, it applies in the not-for-profit sector as well. When it comes to contractors and say contractors working from home, all the obligations are the same in that a contractor, if they're performing work for you, again, coming back to the definitions that Dickson walked through, we're interested in the PCBU's obligations to its workers, and a contractor is a worker because it's someone who performs work for you. Having said that, your obligation here is to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of your workers, and that means eliminating risks if you can or reducing them. Now, it's going to be different how far you may have to go in relation to an employee and the environment you create for them than you do with a contractor, depending on really how much control you have. So if it's a contractor who's working for you maybe as a sole trader, who's really just a sort of one-man band, they're going to be very similar obligations you'll have to them as you do to your employees. But if it's a contractor which is actually a company which has its own series of employees of its own, and it might have its own work health safety systems in place, or it certainly should, then the steps you might need to take there will be less because you're going to have limited control over their workplaces because of the contractual relationship you'll have with them. The takeaway point here is you still have to do something. You still have to take some steps to ensure that your contractors are safe and that they're in a safe working environment. But absolutely, you can do that in things like within your contract. You can get some assurances from them in terms of what they are actually doing. Equally, when you're talking about the more, as I said, more sort of sole trader type contractor or single employee contractor, you might take the same approach as you do with your employees and do something like implement a working from home checklist. So have them basically do an assessment of their workplace and then get them to return that to you so that they're effectively warranting to you that their home environment is safe. The laws, when they talk about reasonably practicable, are not asking you to go and enter the home of every single employee and watch them work and make sure they don't trip over cords. That would be going too far. And so the law is pretty sensible here and says, look, do something, make sure they can do an assessment of their space so that they can go and identify hazards, and that will ordinarily be enough.
Excellent, thanks, James. Kind of following on from that last point there around the work from home checklist, I've got a question here, a couple of questions. Firstly, can we provide generic WHS policies and procedures? And secondly, how often should those work from home checklists be filled out?
Yeah, good question. So can we provide them? Definitely. You can have a whole range of WHS policies depending on what the business is. Every business needs at least a generic work health and safety policy, and that's something we definitely provide to all of our clients. And then, of course, the working from home checklist is something that we would usually add to a generic WHS policy, because most businesses, even if they don't have a current approach where they've got workers working from home, it's something that may crop up from time to time, and that can just be, the business may say we want everyone in the office, but there are some employees who have to work from home from time to time, maybe because of care responsibilities and those types of things. So even if it's not a general thing for the business, it's something that can come up. So we can include a working from home checklist in those policies. In terms of how often to have that done, it's a really good question. You don't want with any of your procedures to have them sort of be, handed out, popped in the top drawer and forgotten about. The key thing with a working from home policy, it just needs to be current. Now, it stays current as long as the working environment remains the same. So one of the things you can do is include within those policies an obligation on the part of the employee that should anything change in their work environment at home, that then they're required to, number one, notify the business, and then number two, carry out another work from home checklist. Because it's going to be very hard for an employer to know if something's happening, and often it's things like renovations. There are some cases out there where employees have been injured in renovations when they've been working from home, but the employer's found themselves on the hook. So an obligation for the employee to let you know there are changes is important. And beyond that, then it's just something like if that's not happening, or everyone's suspiciously quiet about all of those things, maybe every 6 months, just to send out those policies again. But look, a good consultation mechanism, which will exist in a standard WHS policy, will ensure that you're constantly talking to your employees. And so if there are, quarterly catch-ups, or maybe even more frequent, those employees will have an opportunity just to raise things with their managers about any changes, and it can be dealt with there. So it could be a sort of recurring question that managers ask in relation to employees working from home. Hey, are there any changes to your working from home setup? And if they say no, there's not, well, then you don't need to at the 6-month mark issue that. So yeah, look, there are lots of different approaches you can employ here to that, and it really is highly variable on what the environment is, what the consultation might look like. But with all else failing, circulating those every 6 months is a general standard you can sort of stick to.
Yeah, excellent. That's helpful, James. Thank you for that. Another question relating to working from home, and this is one we commonly get from our clients as well. So let's say the work from home checklist is filled out and maybe there are some issues that are identified. Who should kind of bear the cost if, say, the employee needs a new chair or a new desk or something like that?
Yeah, look, that can get a little bit grey. Ordinarily, the idea is that the employee is going to be responsible for it if they're electing to work from home. It can be different where, for example, an employer doesn't have an office. Maybe it closes its office and then sends employees to work from home. They may, in that instance, not be able to make that employee bear the cost of it. So it ordinarily, the position is the employee will will bear the cost. Having said that, where the employer's the driving it, it's more likely the employer will need to bear the cost. Things you can do to make sure that that doesn't turn into sort of a really complicated situation or some kind of conflict with the employee is, for example, at the time of hiring people, being very clear about, the expectation that if they're going to work from home, that they'll need to do so in a safe working environment, and that's something they need to organise. Equally, if you've got employees, if you've got an office and you've got employees saying, "Oh, look, I'd like to work from home," but they don't have a safe working space, as an employer, as a general position, you don't necessarily have a strict obligation, or the employee doesn't have a right to work from home, and so it would be, okay in that instance to say, we're happy for you to work from home as long as your home workplace is safe. So if you can get it safe, and that's on you to bear the cost of that. Once it's safe, we'll let you work from home. But until it's safe, we've got a perfectly good office for you to work in. So it can very much be case by case, context dependent. But again, setting those expectations potentially at the time of hiring can help you down the track in relation to who's going to have to bear the cost of those things.
Yeah, thanks, James. Question around the WHS changes in relation to mental health. Question is, what are some examples of practices that can adequately mitigate those risks, and particularly the risk of poor management?
Yeah, so it's probably a bit of a tricky one. The changes around mental health are really the psychosocial risks are really looking at the design of work. So if you are going to then try and reduce or minimize those risks that come out of design, now these are things like, when I talk about the design of work, it can be things like poor job control. It can be, so limited ability to have an influence on when the work is performed, or how deadlines might be met. It can be things like not having clear understanding of what falls within an employee's area of work. So what's within their position description, what isn't a duty. These are the types of things that the law is now recognizing as risks. So I suppose practices to mitigate those risks, the big ones is management training. So, it's common in a lot of businesses that people with strong technical skills get promoted to managers, and that's a very common occurrence, but they don't actually necessarily have managerial skills. So making sure you're doing something in your business to actually train managers in how to manage, not just turning them into managers because they've got good technical skills. So processes in place there, just management training. There are other things like actually looking at the organizational design. So mapping it first, even things like those position descriptions. Do we have clear position descriptions? Do we have a clear org chart? Do we have a clear understanding of who is responsible for what? So those are, it really depends which risk you're dealing with, what you might do. A lot of that then, and management, there are just things like your more standard management training in relation to things like, it's even things like this webinar, for managers to understand risks in relation to the workers' health and safety, but also looking at things like harassment, discrimination, and bullying. So making managers aware of what the law actually says around harassment, discrimination, and bullying, what those things actually are, and the key takeaway for all of those things is that the answer is it's a really, really low bar for all of those things. So training managers to say this is what harassment is, and they can therefore be armed to look out for it. Those things in and of themselves, just train your managers, will make them better managers when they understand all of those risks within the business. So yeah, look, the broad answer there is train your managers, but otherwise, policies and procedures as well, really important. And then I think sort of organization mapping to make sure there are sort of no structural risks that are going to create those psychosocial hazards. But that one I think I could probably talk about for hours. So, definitely book in a consultation for that one. We can chat about that one more.
Yeah, for sure. And we might just do one more question for the purpose of time. So one here, can an employer restrict someone from working from home while caring for a young child at the same time, i.e. refusing work from home while being a primary carer?
Yeah, this is really common, and the short answer is yes. There are a lot of things to weigh up in that many employees have a right under the Fair Work Act to request flexible work arrangements, which might include working from home, different start times, altered hours, those types of things. And so the law gives them an express right to request that, and in short, an employer can reject that request on reasonable business grounds. The critical thing here is that you can't be a carer of a child and a full-time worker. You can't be responsible for both. It's probably also not fair to people who do care for children to say that's something that can just be done in the background of also performing a job. It's a full-time job caring for a child, and the law understands that. So you can't have two full-time jobs. You can't be working another job while you're working for your employer. So yes, that's the basis on which an employer can say, no, you're not allowed to be caring for a child while you're performing work for us. It gets a little bit grey, for example, if there is another carer at home. And so then it's a matter of, it might be a mother who's then mostly working, but lunch breaks it can then spend with the child, or it might be, the discrimination laws come into play here, and it's a mother who's working, your general 9 to 5 throughout the day, but just so, for example, they can take occasional breaks to be with the child, you can make a small accommodation for them to just occasionally have time with the child for whatever they may need. Now, that of course, there's, as I said, there's discrimination law overlay in relation to that. But that is all predicated on the idea that they're not a full-time carer for that child, and you just can't be a full-time carer for a child while you're also trying to perform work for your employer. So yes, the answer to that one is you can actually restrict it, but I think be careful about it because there's a discrimination law overlay, and you will often need to make some accommodations for them. All right, I think that's all we've got time for. So again, thanks everyone for joining us today. We would, as I mentioned earlier at the start, really appreciate if you can complete, it's a 30-second survey. So you can include your contact details there to receive the complimentary legal consultation. For anyone we didn't get to your questions today, that might be a good place for us to have a chat with you about it. And we can otherwise just help you with complying with your safety obligations generally. So once again, thanks for joining us.